In this video, I'm going to show you how to bypass your stock cooling fan sensor and wire in a stacked Pro Control temp gauge. This past weekend, I did the M-Tune coolant reroute, and in the process, somehow broke my coolant temp sensor and sender. I thought the car would have to sit until I bought a new sensor and sender. But I looked more into this stacked Pro Control temp gauge that I bought, and you can actually wire it into the fan control relay. First, let me explain how the cooling fans turn on regularly. Note that this is for the 1.8 Miatas. 1.6 Miatas are wired differently. So starting from the temp sensor, this sensor is connected straight to the ECU. The sensor sends out a certain amount of volts to the ECU depending on how hot the engine's coolant is. When it starts sending out the voltage it's supposed to send out when the coolant's hot, the ECU sees that and then sends a ground to the cooling fan relay, which in turn turns on the fan. After doing the coolant reroute, I got a check engine light for the coolant temp sensor. While checking the sensor, I also broke the sender, which runs the gauge, so I replaced both of them. After replacing the sensor and the sender, I checked the temperature my gauge was reading when the fans turned on, and it wasn't until 235 degrees, which is way high. The ECU is supposed to turn on the fans at 207, but for some reason mine wasn't. And that's why I looked into running the radiator fans off the gauge. Also to note that when the cooling fans turn on at the stock 235 degrees, the stock temperature gauge barely even moved. It was like at 1155. It didn't even move past that stock position, which what it looks like right now. So here's the wiring for the gauge. Red is positive. There's two blacks, one for the gauge and one for the switched ground relay that you can set to either the orange wire or the blue wire. More on that soon. And then you have the yellow, which is for your data logger. Your white is for illumination, and gray and purple are to the actual temp sensor. The gauge has 4 different switching styles or settings. I guess that's what you call them. 2 for each the low and high warning. Of those 2, one will have the relay grounded when below the warning point and switch to open when above, and vice versa. Looking at the Miata's wiring diagram for the cooling fans, the cooling relay gets its ground from the ECU, but there's also a wire going to the diagnostic port on the driver's side of the engine bay for testing the fans. Looking at the diagnostic box, you can see the ground and TFA at the bottom cluster of connections. And that TFA pin is the test fan pin. When you connect it to the ground pin, it'll turn on the fans when you give the car power. So what I did was depin the test fan pin, and you can see it here all wrapped up, and connect that switched ground to the gauge so that when the gauge hits a certain temperature, it'll ground that test fan pin and in turn turn on the fans. These pins are really small and they aren't really common to find, so what I do is use a spade connector, I think is what they're called, and cut one off and it'll fit right in. So you can see here it slips right in, and you can jump the other one with this one. So on that orange wire, all I did was crimp on one of those spade connectors and plug it into that pin and tape it up. The reason why I'm using the orange wire is because the orange wire is the low warning switch ground wire. The blue one is the high warning switch ground wire. So the low warning and high warning are exactly what they sound like. The low warning is a warning for whenever the coolant temperature is too low, and the high warning is whenever it's too high. Right now, the coolant temp is below 100 degrees, and I have the low warning set to 215 degrees. Once the coolant temperature reaches 215 degrees, the cooling fans will turn on. You could also set it to turn on when you hit the high warning, but you have to use the blue wire. So now I have the car on and I'm going to let it warm up so I can show y'all how exactly these cooling low and high warnings work. So the reason why I use the low warning is because I wanted the fans to turn on before my gauge turns red, which I have set for the high warning. So I set the low warning point really high, and I set the gauge to switch the ground after it passes the low warning mode. So right now I have the low warning mode set to 215, which is way lower than the stock 235 degrees the fans are turning on, so my engine does stay a little cooler. With a gauge like this, for most of the time the gauge will actually be in the low warning mode, but it'll look normal because it's white. And once it passes the low warning mode, it'll turn blue. which is when the fans kick on. And if the fans aren't cooling it properly, it'll turn red and then flashing red to warn me. So my low warning temp is set to 215. And so right there the gauge face turned blue, and that's when it hit normal operating range, or it's out of the low warning mode now. So this is the stock, or what I have to set the stock gauge color, but because we're always in low warning, the gauge is always white. And the fans were on right now and they just turned off, and you can see the temp lower. That's it for this video. If you want to see more about the car or the gauge, just let me know in the comments. All the wiring diagrams and links to where to buy the Coolant Reroute, the gauge, or whatever will be in the description as well. Thanks for watching.